The boat rocked gently as it approached the mist-shrouded island, its silhouette barely visible against the grey sky. A sense of unease settled over the group of strangers aboard, but none could quite place why. As they disembarked, the heavy air clung to their skin, thick with an unspoken dread. The island felt alive, watching them, as if the very earth beneath their feet whispered forgotten secrets. They were told nothing of the island's history, only that it was abandoned, untouched by civilization. Yet, as the jungle swallowed them whole, each step felt wrong, each breath a little too shallow. The trees creaked in the wind, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for something just out of sight. The deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the silence became, broken only by the occasional screech of unseen creatures. And then they found it a massive, crumbling structure at the heart of the island, as if something had been waiting for them. A strange, pulsating energy hummed from within, like the heartbeat of the island itself, urging them closer despite the primal terror building in their chests. The doors opened on their own, the wood groaning as if protesting their intrusion. Inside, the walls were lined with faded photographs, faces of long-forgotten souls staring at them with hollow eyes. The air was thick, tasting metallic, and every step they took seemed to echo unnervingly loud. It wasn't until they discovered the old journal, its pages filled with frantic scrawls, that they learned the truth. The island wasn't abandoned, it was cursed. The souls of the damned had been trapped here, bound to the land forever, feeding on the fear of those who dared trespass. The ground trembled beneath their feet as if something was awakening, something ancient and hungry. Panic set in, and the group scrambled to escape, but the island had other plans. The trees closed in around them, the air growing colder with each passing moment. Shadows moved just beyond their vision, whispering in languages that twisted their minds. The very island itself seemed to shift, reshaping its paths, trapping them in a maze of horrors. They weren't just lost, they were being hunted. Desperation set in, and they realized that escaping wasn't an option, not anymore. The island didn't just want them to fear it, it wanted them to join it. The wind howled through the trees, an eerie wail that seemed to carry with it the voices of the island's long-dead inhabitants. The group, now scattered and desperate, tried to call out to one another, but their words were swallowed by the oppressive fog that thickened with every passing minute. One by one, they found themselves drawn back to the crumbling structure at the island's heart, as if the land itself was pulling them toward its center, like moths to a flame. It wasn't a matter of choice anymore, they weren't running to it, they were being guided, their limbs moving against their will. The faintest outline of a figure stood in the doorway, watching them with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark, though its features were otherwise obscured by the thick, roiling mist. When they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them, sealing them in a suffocating silence. The room they found themselves in was vast, but the air was so thick with dust and decay that it was hard to make out anything clearly. The walls were lined with shelves of strange, tarnished objects, arcane trinkets, bones, and what looked like artifacts from long-forgotten rituals. The temperature dropped, and each of them felt the unmistakable sensation of eyes upon them, 1,000 unseen watchers observing their every movement. The faint hum of the island's heartbeat vibrated through the floorboards beneath them, growing louder and more insistent, vibrating in their bones. It was as though the place itself was alive, a monstrous entity whose hunger had existed long before their arrival. They turned their heads in unison, a low whisper on the wind catching their attention. Leave. Leave. It wasn't a voice. It was a thought, an ancient message embedded into the very fabric of the island. But none of them dared listen. As the minutes bled into hours, they began to realize that time no longer followed its usual course. There was no day and night here. The air itself felt endless, like an ocean stretching beyond the horizon with no shore in sight. One by one, the group started to crack. Anxiety turned to paranoia. Whispers in the corners of the room began to manifest into full-bodied shadows, flickering in and out of existence, just beyond their peripheral vision. It was Ella who noticed it first. The photographs. At first they had been nothing but faded faces, staring lifelessly from their frames. But now, she realized with a creeping horror, the faces were changing. The eyes, they were following her. They were no longer static, they blinked, shifted, even smiled in the dim light. She screamed, backing away from the wall, only to crash into Tom, who had been pacing restlessly in the corner. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that matched hers. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. But Ella could see it in his eyes. He was no longer certain they even could. "We're trapped." Suddenly the room seemed to twist around them, the walls stretching and contorting like the insides of a nightmare. The floor buckled beneath them, sending them tumbling into an abyss of darkness. When they hit the ground, it wasn't stone. They landed on something soft, organic, like the flesh of some great beast. The floor seemed to pulse beneath them, beating like a heart, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. They stumbled to their feet, but the moment they did, the shadows coiled around them like serpents, squeezing the breath from their lungs. The whispers grew louder, now all around them, deafening in their intensity. "Join us. Become one with us." The words, though garbled and incomprehensible, carried a heavy weight, a promise of something. But what? Despair flooded their minds as a dark, crushing force bore down on them. Suddenly, a guttural scream pierced the air. It was Sarah. She had been closest to the wall when the room began to warp, and now she was reaching out for something, her fingers brushing against the edges of the photographs. Her eyes locked onto the picture of a woman, pale and lifeless, with a gaping wound on her neck. The woman in the photo blinked, her mouth stretching into a grotesque, twisted smile. The photograph began to bleed, and before anyone could react, Sarah's body jerked violently, as if an invisible force had yanked her forward. She vanished into the frame, her scream echoing from within the picture itself, swallowed up by the darkness. The remaining group members froze, eyes wide in horror, not knowing whether they had seen some kind of trick of the mind or whether the island had truly taken her. No one dared move, but the whispers came again, louder this time, and something shifted in the air, a presence, ancient and terrifying, closing in on them. One by one, they realized the truth. The island wasn't just cursed. The island itself was a living, breathing thing, and it had been waiting for them, waiting for the right moment to claim them, to turn them into one of its own. They weren't simply trespassers, they were offerings. Sarah was gone, and it was only a matter of time before the rest would follow. In the distance they heard something stirring, something far too large to be human. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the earth quaking as though the island was waking up, stretching, preparing to feast. The trees outside began to sway violently, their trunks twisting into grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the sky, arms reaching for a meal. The walls of the structure around them began to bleed, dripping thick, black ichor, the air growing heavy with an unbearable weight. Tom, his face a mask of terror, looked around at the others. "We have to run. Now. It's too late to fight." But even as he said the words, something seemed to shift in his eyes, a dark understanding. He wasn't just afraid of the island. He had accepted it. Without warning, he turned and ran toward the farthest corner of the room, his footsteps erratic, his body jerking unnaturally as though pulled by some unseen force. The others followed, a mix of terror and desperation pushing them forward. But the walls continued to shift, to close in on them, and they realized too late that there was no escape. The island was no longer just an island. It was a trap, a living, breathing nightmare that fed off their fear. And it would not let them leave. Behind them, the doors slammed shut with an earth-shattering noise, and the whispers returned, now louder than ever before. "Join us, join us." The sound filled the room, vibrating in their bones, pulling them into the darkness. The island had already claimed them. All they could do now was scream and wait to become one with it. The air grew colder, and with it, a suffocating sense of inevitability. The walls of the room continued to ripple, as if the entire building were a living, breathing organism, each pulse a reminder of how little control they had left. The floor beneath them groaned, as if the structure itself were awakening, stretching and reshaping with unnatural intent. The shadows that had once lingered at the edges of their vision were now taking shape, tall, gaunt figures, their faces obscured by dark hoods, yet their eyes gleamed with a cruel, knowing light. They were waiting. Ella could feel the presence of the island pressing in on them, thick and suffocating, wrapping around them like a net. It was hungry. She had no doubt about it anymore. The whispers, the shadows, the suffocating dread, it was all part of a single, malevolent force. The entity that inhabited the island, that controlled it, was alive, and it was using them as bait for something darker, something far worse. "I don't want to die here," she muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible over the hum of the room. Tom was staring at the ground, his hands shaking. He hadn't spoken since the moment he'd run toward the corner of the room. There was something about his silence, something that had shifted within him. She could see it now, a sort of understanding, a quiet resignation in his eyes. He knew what was coming. Tom, Ella's voice broke, and he looked up slowly, a strange, hollow smile on his lips. His eyes, those wide, desperate eyes, were clouded with something that wasn't fear. It was acceptance. "The island. It's not going to let us leave," he said, his voice distant, as if speaking from the edge of some awful revelation. "We've already given it what it wants. We're part of it now." Ella recoiled. The words were like acid, eating away at her resolve. The very air seemed to choke her, the walls closing in tighter, the pulse of the island's heartbeat growing faster. She could feel it now, the presence. Something ancient, something endless, reaching out for them. She backed away, her eyes darting to the others. Sarah was gone, swallowed up by the photograph, her scream still echoing in their minds. The image of her disappearing, her body jerking forward, pulled into the photo with unnatural force, was burned into Ella's memory. The figure in the doorway shifted again, stepping forward from the mist. It was tall, far too tall, its form ragged and distorted, flickering in and out of reality like an old film reel. Its eyes gleamed like burning embers, its mouth stretching into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. As it stepped forward, the air thickened, and the ground trembled again, as though the island were shifting its weight. Ella froze, her heart racing, unable to tear her eyes away from the thing that was moving toward them, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, its skin blackened and covered in patches of writhing, pulsating sores. The creature's smile widened impossibly, and in a low, rasping voice, it whispered, "Join us." Her body refused to move, and she realized with a sickening jolt that she could no longer remember if she was still breathing. The others weren't moving either, their eyes locked onto the figure with a strange sort of reverence, as if drawn to it, powerless against the overwhelming pull. Tom was the first to step forward, his feet dragging as if he were in a trance. His voice was hollow when he spoke again. "We can't fight it. We have to let go." Ella's stomach churned. She didn't want to die here, didn't want to become like Sarah, but the island was consuming them. She could feel it now, sinking into her very bones, taking root in her thoughts. The longer she resisted, the harder it became to think clearly, to focus. The walls around them warped, and the floor beneath their feet seemed to ripple like water, shifting and undulating as if alive. The whispers grew louder, crawling into her ears, into her mind. "Join us. Join us." The air tasted of salt and iron, and Ella's vision blurred as she staggered back, unable to stop her legs from moving, pulling her closer to the dark, hissing thing that awaited her. The walls twisted and bulged, as though trying to swallow her whole, and she could feel the pulse of the island beneath her skin, resonating through her like a disease, a force she could no longer escape. A scream tore itself from her throat, but it was swallowed up by the oppressive silence that filled the room. She was no longer sure if she was screaming for help, or if she was simply screaming to stop herself from giving in. The figure loomed closer, and Ella felt her mind begin to crack, the last of her resistance crumbling like dust in the wind. "Join us." A sudden, violent motion snapped her out of her trance. She blinked, the world swimming around her, and for a moment she was free. She turned toward the others, but they had already begun to change. Tom had fallen to his knees, his hands gripping his head, his mouth hanging open in a soundless scream. His skin began to split, as though something inside him was trying to escape. The others weren't much better. One was clawing at their own face, while another seemed to melt into the floor, his body warping, becoming part of the island itself. No, no, Ella screamed, backing away, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here. Not like this. The figure in the doorway tilted its head, a grotesque noise vibrating from deep within its chest. It's too late. Ella's blood ran cold as the walls began to close in on her. Her vision darkened, her breath became shallow, and she could feel her body, her very soul, being drawn toward that thing, the ancient entity that had waited so long for them to arrive. There was no escape. In that final moment, she felt it, the island, its mind, its hunger, its insatiable need for more. It had taken Sarah. It had taken Tom. And now it was taking her. The walls, the floor, the air, it all pressed in on her as the figure reached out, its claws like dark branches, its smile widening, stretching impossibly far. And then, there was nothing. Only the heartbeat of the island. And the whispers. The pulse of the island throbbed in Ella's chest, drowning out everything else. Her mind felt as though it were being pulled apart, threads unraveling in a dark void. Her legs moved involuntarily, as if some unseen force was guiding her forward, coaxing her into the embrace of that terrible thing in the doorway. The air grew colder still, the shadows creeping along the floor, twisting like the fingers of the damned. The whispers clawed at her mind, burrowing deep, filling her with an overwhelming sense of despair. Join us, the voice, a low, guttural rasp, was no longer a whisper. It vibrated through her very bones, speaking not just to her ears but to her soul. And then Ella could see it, a vision of herself, her reflection warped and twisted, her eyes hollow, her skin pale and decayed, her mouth stretched into an unholy grin. It was her, yet it wasn't. She saw herself as part of the island, part of the darkness. She was the island now. Just another face in the gallery of the damned. But something, a flicker, still lingered within her. A part of her mind, small and desperate, screamed against the pull. She didn't know where it came from, but there it was, a memory, a fragment of her life before the island. She wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. With a final, gut-wrenching effort, Ella forced herself to look away from the figure in the doorway. Her body rebelled, but she struggled against it, her breath ragged, her mind racing. She stumbled backward, her eyes darting around the room, seeking anything other than the thing that was drawing her in. But there was nothing but the walls, closing in, warping, pulsating, like the very heart of the island was beating in time with her own. A scream ripped from her throat as she reached for the door she had thought was sealed, the one she had believed was too late to escape. But it opened, as if the island itself, that ancient, hungry being, was giving her one last chance. Without a second thought, she ran. Her legs felt like lead, every step sluggish, as though the earth itself was trying to pull her back, to drag her into its depths. The shadows writhed, reaching for her, pulling at her clothes, at her limbs. The island was alive. The island was hunting. But she ran. Through the corridors of the crumbling structure, the walls closing in, the floor warping beneath her, she sprinted, pushing herself harder than she ever thought possible. The sound of her own heartbeat was deafening in her ears, mingling with the relentless whispers that filled the air. Join us. Join us. But she would not. She refused to. Ella's hand touched the doorframe, the last barrier between her and the outside. The fog. The boat. Freedom. The ground shook violently, as if the island was in its death throes. The walls around her cracked, groaning as they collapsed in on themselves, like the body of a beast whose wounds had finally become too much to bear. The air thickened, the oppressive presence of the island nearly choking her, but she didn't stop. In the next moment, she was outside. The boat. The mist still swirled thickly, but it was different now, less suffocating, less alive. Ella gasped in a breath of air, the cool wind biting at her skin. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the wet sand, coughing and gasping for breath. She hadn't even realized she was crying until she felt the wetness against her face. She had made it. She was free. But as she turned back, the mist parted just enough for her to glimpse the crumbling structure, the monstrous silhouette standing in the doorway. It was watching her, the eyes gleaming like burning embers, the figure taller than it had ever been, now more grotesque, more twisted. And then the ground shook again, a violent tremor that sent her sprawling to the ground. The island. It wasn't done. For a moment, Ella thought she could hear something like a whisper, a voice calling her name from the depths of the island. And then, before she could take another breath, she heard a noise, something faint. A scraping sound like nails on glass. It was coming from the direction of the forest, the jungle just beyond the shore. And then she saw them. Figures emerging from the trees, shadows shifting in the fog, gaunt, twisted shapes that moved with a terrible grace. Eyes, glowing like embers in the night, watching her with an expression that was not quite hunger, but something far worse. The island was alive, and it wanted her back. For a fleeting moment, Ella thought she might make it. Maybe she could escape. Maybe there was still hope. But then she saw it. The boat, once anchored on the shore, was no longer there. It had vanished. Ella stood, trembling, her mind screaming, her body betraying her. Behind her, the jungle roiled and twisted. The shadows were closing in. And in that moment she realized the truth. The island was never going to let her go. It was waiting. It was always waiting. She had only ever been part of its endless hunger. The whispers returned, louder than ever. "Join us." And as they pulled her into the dark, Ella felt her body being torn apart, her soul unraveling piece by piece, becoming one with the island, just like the others before her. The heartbeat of the island continued, the whispers never ending. And in the distance, something stirred, something ancient, something dark. It was waiting for the next to come.